All right, welcome back, everyone. Get ready,
Yes.
because today we are going deep. We're talking about some pretty crazy research about all the hidden forces that shape the choices we make and even what we believe. It's really wild stuff, honestly. So are we really in control of our lives as much as we think? Let's find out.
It's a question that has had psychologists scratching their heads for centuries. And what's really fascinating is that so much of what drives us isn't even on our radar. It's all happening below the surface in that mysterious realm of the subconscious.
Okay, so the subconscious, break that down for me a little. How does that world actually, influence us?
Well, one of the most mind-blowing examples is this thing called implicit bias. These are basically like these unconscious associations we have that can influence our actions without us even realizing it. Like we're on autopilot. And get this, studies have shown that these biases, a lot of times rooted in societal stereotypes, can really have an impact, even in areas we think of as objective, like, legal decisions.
Wait, you're saying our implicit biases can affect things like, say, legal sentencing? That's kind of scary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little unsettling, to be honest. For instance, there's research showing that judges, even with all their training and expertise, they might, without even realizing it, give harsher sentences to people with names that are stereotypically associated with certain racial groups. And the crazy thing is, the crimes committed are exactly the same.
So even in a courtroom where fairness is supposed to be the top priority, these unconscious biases can still sneak in.
Totally. And it's not just these big, serious matters like court cases. These biases pop up everywhere in everyday life. It's what we call priming effects. Like, have you ever noticed how the music they play in a store can, like, subtly make you want to buy certain things?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's almost like my brain's just on autopilot sometimes. But how does that connect back to implicit bias? They seem kind of different.
Right, so they both tap into those unconscious associations we were talking about. With priming, it's the environment that gives you cues that sort of wake up those associations in your brain. And then boom, they're influencing your choices. It's crazy. Researchers actually did this experiment where they played French music in a store's wine section. And guess what? People bought way more French wine.
It makes sense. Our brains are just constantly connecting the dots even if we don't even know it's happening.
Yeah.
So then where does free will fit into all of this? If we're being influenced by all these unconscious forces, do we really have any say in the decisions we make?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
There's this super famous experiment by a guy named Benjamin Libet, and it really shook things up. He found that the brain activity that happens when you're about to make a decision actually occurs a fraction of a second before you're even consciously aware of making it.
So our brains are already deciding before we even know about it.
Hold on, so does that mean free will is just a big illusion? Well, Libet himself believed we still have what he called a veto power, like a free won't, where we can consciously stop ourselves from actually acting on those initial unconscious impulses. But then later research using brain scans showed that you can actually predict decisions seconds before someone is consciously aware of making them. It's a really complex debate, and the implications for like how we think about things like autonomy and more responsibility are still being hashed out.
Whoa, it really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew.
Right.
Right. And speaking of questioning everything, how much does our environment actually shape how we behave? I mean, we all like to think we're the ones in the driver's seat, but are we really?
There are two classic studies, the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment, that offer some really disturbing insights into just how powerful those situational influences can be. The Stanford Prison Experiment was wild. It involved randomly assigning students to be either guards or prisoners, just like a role-playing thing, but it showed how quickly totally normal college kids could turn into like abusive authority figures or totally submissive inmates. And get this, it was just because of the environment they were put in.
It's kind of mind-blowing how a simple role play could turn so intense so quickly.
Yeah.
What about the Milgram experiment? That one always kind of freaked me out when I first learned about it.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic. In Milgram's experiment, people were told by like this authority figure to give what they thought were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. And the really crazy thing is how many of them kept on administering the shocks, even when they were clearly upset and worried about it. But they kept going simply because this authority figure was telling them they had to.
It just shows how easily we can be swayed by external pressure, especially from people we see as authority figures. So we've got these unconscious biases, environmental cues, and situational pressures all playing a part in our behavior. But at least our brains are good at rationalizing all these choices we make, right? What about that cognitive dissonance thing?
Ah, yes, cognitive dissonance. It's basically this mental tension that pops up whenever our actions don't line up with our beliefs. And to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling, our minds can do some pretty impressive mental gymnastics. We end up rationalizing our behavior, even if it means twisting our beliefs around to match what we did.
Can you give me an example of that in action?
Totally. There's this classic study where participants had to do a really boring task. Afterwards, some were given a small amount of money to tell the next participant that the task was fun, while others got a much bigger amount to tell the same lie. And here's the kicker. The ones who were paid less ended up rating the task as actually more enjoyable.
Wait, seriously? That doesn't make any sense. Why would they rate it as more enjoyable if they got paid less to lie about it?
Because their minds were wrestling with that dissonance. I wouldn't lie about a boring task for such a measly amount of money, right? So, to smooth things over in their heads, they convinced themselves the task wasn't actually that bad after all.
So it's like our brains are trying to protect our egos, even if it means like bending reality a bit.
Exactly. Cognitive dissonance helps explain why we do things like stick with bad investments, justify those impulse buys we didn't need, or hold on to beliefs even when there's tons of evidence saying we're wrong.
It's amazing how much goes on behind the scenes in our brains. And speaking of things that aren't always what they seem, let's talk about memory. Get ready to have your faith in your own memories shaken up a bit.
Right. Memory is a wild thing. The work of Elizabeth Loftus has been absolutely groundbreaking in this area. She showed that memory isn't just a static recording of events, it's actually a dynamic process that's way more vulnerable to influence and manipulation than we think.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about her car crash study. The one where even tiny changes in the way a question was asked could change people's memories.
Exactly. People watched a video of a car accident and then later were asked about how fast the cars were going. The ones who were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other actually estimated a higher speed than those who were asked how fast were they going when they hit each other. And get this, they even remembered seeing broken glass, even though there wasn't any.
Whoa, so even changing one word can change our memories. That's a little freaky. What are the implications of that, though?
Well, it has huge implications, especially when you think about the legal system. Eyewitness testimony used to be seen as like the gold standard of evidence, but now we're way more cautious about it because we know that memory is definitely not foolproof.
It really makes you realize how easily our memories can be messed with. And it seems like that vulnerability is even more apparent when you look at how much social situations can influence how we act, like with the bystander effect.
Yeah.
Imagine you're witnessing an emergency. Would you jump in to help?
That's the big question, isn't it? The whole idea of the bystander effect came about because of that really tragic case of Kitty Genovese. Remember that? She was murdered while a bunch of people saw it happening, but nobody stepped in to help.
Yeah, that case is just heartbreaking.
Mm.
So what is it that stops people from taking action in those situations?
One of the big things is what we call diffusion of responsibility. Basically, when there are more people around, it feels like it's less of a personal responsibility to do something. Like everyone's thinking, oh, someone else will call 911.
Right, but what about the fact that nobody else was doing anything? Didn't that seem weird to the people watching?
That's where this thing called social proof comes in. When we see a bunch of people not reacting to something, we tend to think, okay, maybe it's not actually that serious. It's crazy how powerful group dynamics can be. They can actually stop people from acting, even in life or death situations.
It's mind-blowing and kind of scary to think about how much of what we do is influenced by things we're not even aware of. Wow, we covered a lot today. From those implicit biases and priming to cognitive dissonance and the bystander effect, it sounds like this whole idea of being in control might actually just be an illusion.
It really might be. But the good news is, now that we understand these influences a little better, we can start to recognize them in ourselves and in other people. We can question our assumptions and hopefully make more deliberate choices.
That's a great point. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. And for anyone listening who is just as fascinated by this as we are, we're going to share some extra resources in the show notes so you can keep learning about all this. Until next time.